So this movie's difficult. One of the things I've noticed as I've done these throughout the last couple years is that let's be generous, I'd say about 95% of cases, you can tell when you leave a theater how you felt about a movie, and why you felt that way. Maybe not in as in-depth or well thought out or well phrased a way as if I was, a normal film critic who sat down and wrote these out a day or two later and let them simmer a little bit. I'm coming out and just giving you my gut reactions. So, for instance, last night I knew I didn't like Venom, and I knew kind of why. I could boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, And that's, conversely, last year I knew I loved Their Finest, and I could say ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom. But every now and then, I bump into one of these movies. One of these films that is different. It's told differently. Its narrative structure is a little different. Its character choices are different than the norm, than what we kind of would consider the way stories are normally told or whatnot. And because of that, it's a little harder to wrap your head around what you've seen and kind of give it that yay or nay judgment, which in a way is a real credit to the film and a mark in its favor, because boy, isn't it nice to have to think about something, and to have to really go through it in your head. So much of art and artistic things are served up to us very quickly, and like I say, you can determine very fast like or dislike or middle of the road. But to actually have to ponder your opinion is an interesting thing, and I'm glad movies like this kind of come along and do that for me. This is also one of those films that just kind of popped up out of nowhere. Again, you don't see trailers or commercials for movies that much anymore, but this one, I routinely look at the Malco app and the site looking for movies to go see, and normally it gives you this list of what's coming and when it's coming, and you're like, okay, I can view trailers on them. No, this one I looked at Ridgeway and boom, there it was. No precursor. So you're going into it without a lot of information. So if you haven't heard of the film, and if you're like me, you probably haven't. So Emma Thompson is a judge of, I believe she's supposed to be family law or something to that effect, because it seems like a lot of cases she's talking about involve children and the rights of parents and all this. But anyway, she is called to rule on this case of a young boy, 17 years old, who he and his family are devout Jehovah's Witnesses, and he has leukemia, and the only way to save his life is with a medication that requires a blood transfusion, and he, part of their doctrine is they do not believe in blood transfusions. It's against God. So she has to go and kind of make this decision on, because he's a minor, he can't just say, I don't want the transfusion. They have to rule on it and all this. So she has to go and, make the decision. Now, here's the thing. That in itself is a movie. That's a movie right there, this whole case. And that's kind of what you're led to believe from the one trailer that the movie is. It's that thing. And there's also the subplot of, while this is going on, she and her husband, played by Stanley Tucci, are going through marital problems and a divorce and all this nonsense. But all that in itself seems like that should be the movie. That's the plot, right? But here's the thing. The movie, that part of it, is done by the middle. The second act, or the end of Act 1 almost, is her making the ruling that he's 17 years old, he's got a lot of life to live, he's a remarkable young man and all this, and give him the damn transfusion. And that happens so early on, you're sitting going, well, wait, what is the conflict? What is going on? What's the rest of the movie going to be about? So the rest of the movie is, and quite interestingly, the rest of the movie is more about the fallout all around. What happens after? You know? And not just kind of to her, but what happens to this young man who has lived his entire life, you know, believing, you know, XYZ, and now that XYZ has been altered for him, not necessarily even by his choice. And now where does that lead him? So he becomes kind of, I don't want to say infatuated with her. It's not like a creepy stalker thing, though it does have kind of those undertones. But he keeps looking to her for new answers. He's all of his life, he's had someone else saying, these are the answers, or, you know, this is where you look for the answers. But now he doesn't have that. He doesn't feel like he has that anymore. So he keeps going to her, and she's trying to, you know, be cold and not so cold, but trying to be professional and adult and say, you know, you can't call me, you can't do this and that. And that's kind of what the rest of the movie is dealing with the fallout of this film, or of her decision. So yeah, first of all, I find that a really interesting thing to focus your movie on. Not so much the decision, which is what so many legal dramas and legal films are about, but to focus on what are the consequences afterwards on the person who makes the judgment and the person who is judged. And especially in a situation like this, where religion is such an important part in a lot of people's lives, that when, you know, a decision is made for you that goes against the thing you've been taught the whole time, what that can do to a person. It's kind of like, I remember one of the things I always loved about Star Trek Deep Space Nine is they said, you know, when they were creating it, you know, in the old days, like the original series and Next Generation, the Enterprise would swoop in, fix a problem, and then fly off. But what happens to the people after the Enterprise leaves? You know, that's kind of what Deep Space Nine was, is there was no running away from the decisions that you made. You had to stay there and face the consequences of them. And so that's kind of a really neat premise. The film also takes a neat way of telling the story. The film doesn't feel like it has a normal structure. It feels more episodic, like it's little things all kind of linked together by a framing device a little bit. And I think because the film is trying, and in some ways much to its favor, to present you with more of a slice of life thing, not so much saying, because life doesn't operate in 3 acts. You know, life doesn't operate in 5 acts. It's, you know, it's kind of, it's, you know, it's twisty-wisty, timey-wimey, you know, Doctor Who stuff. And I think that's what the film is really trying to recreate here. And that's jarring watching it a bit, because we're used to ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. So when you see a film that is much looser in its structure and doesn't follow, you know, that pattern, it takes a while for your brain to kind of link into it and go, okay, this is how the story is being told. And while watching it, I didn't know if I liked that or not. I still don't know if I liked it now, to be honest. Because, again, you're telling... I think that's a fascinating way to do it. I think that's a fascinating way to tell the story, especially since the story is so much about living life, and this boy needs to go live life, and she needs to take control of her life. So telling it much like life is an interesting choice. But as such, I think you miss out on a lot of really great stuff. You could have done a whole movie or a whole play out of just little snippets of this film. You know, like she goes to visit him, she goes to visit the young boy in the hospital, and that whole scene, very short, that could have been a whole play in and of itself, just the two of them debating, the pros and cons of living versus following your faith and all that. And again, every time you think this is where the movie's going to go and this is what it's going to be about, it turns and isn't about that. And again, I think that's because it's supposed to mimic life. Like, one thing I noticed about this, and I thought was kind of cool, is this, when you watch movies, and people make decisions that you're like, why are you making that decision? This movie, the characters make the right decisions in, like, all the instances. In a lot of these movies, the young boy would come to the older woman who's having marital problems and not feeling loved and he'd show her life and beauty, and this is how Emma got her groove back kind of thing. And it doesn't do that. He comes to her with all this, I dreamed of all, very much like a romantic comedy kind of character, and she looks at him and says, you need to go. Okay, this isn't happening. You need to leave. And every time you think she might fall back, like, no, it's always, you need to go. There's a point where he follows her to some party or something somewhere. Like, stalks her, essentially. And she goes and meets him in this kind of side room, and her clerk is there. And she goes, and she sends her clerk out, and I'm like, okay, anybody who works with kids know if you're going to do that, if a kid is doing this, a kid is stalking you or doing something, you are never alone with that kid. That's just not something you do. Okay, because that just leads to trouble. But when the camera shifts, no, her clerk the door is open and he is outside sitting right across from it, watching the whole thing. So it's like, so like I say, the choices that they make are right. So yeah, the more I think about it, the more that's kind of what this movie is. It's more trying to be a slice of life without being a mockumentary or a found footage movie. It's showing the choices and all this. As such, like, again, and one of the other questions I was asking is how do these two stories link up? The story of her and her husband falling out and having all these problems, and this story of, her making this decision and dealing with the fallout of that. And I kept going, how are these two stories going to connect? How are they, how is this, what does one have to do with the other? And they do kind of, in terms of character dynamic and, seeing that she was always in her professional life, she's always very eloquent and always knows what to say and always, all this. And in her private life, she's very shut off. She doesn't talk. Stanley Tucci's constantly doing things trying to get not so much trying to get a rise out of her, but trying to get some kind of reaction from her, good, bad, or indifferent, just so that, they can engage in conversation and keep shutting him down. But by the end, she starts talking, okay, or at least makes starts the process. Anyway, and it's very subtle. It's not something that's, right out there, obvious, character growth. But I'm watching the film, again, going, how are these two stories linking up? I don't get it. But again, going back to that whole kind of premise and that theme, that concept, if any of my Theater 4 students are watching, which I know you're not, the concept of it being real life, what goes on in one place does not affect the other. The story of me dealing, I'm making stuff up here. Me dealing with a troubled student at school doesn't necessarily affect the way I deal with a fight with my best friend out of school. Life doesn't follow a narrative. Things happen, and having a bad day with your husband affects your judgment here and there and there. But the two things don't necessarily lead to a conclusion. So yeah. So that was kind of interesting. I don't feel like I need to talk a lot about the acting in this, because it's the acting is the acting. I mean, they have some brilliant performers in this. Emma Thompson is phenomenal, as Emma Thompson always is. They have a really nice, again, going back to that concept of real life, they have a really nice group of supporting players, none of whom get a lot of development, but that's okay. They're not there to be developed. They're there to add texture. And what I find interesting is that even with not a lot of development, or any development really, for the minor supporting characters, they still feel, for the little time they're on screen, the little things they do, like they're flushed out, like they're real people. So that's really fascinating. I thought that was really well done. I do have to be honest, though. I do not feel that Stanley Tucci and Emma Thompson had any chemistry in this film. Part of that, I think, can be explained by the fact they don't really have any lengthy scenes together. With their films, with their scenes, again, you feel like you're coming in at the middle. You feel like the movie's been running for an hour and you walked in late, and you're like, wait, what is their relationship? What's been going on? What's happening? You really, and again, going with that concept, if you dropped into someone's life just at a certain point, that's how you'd be. But what that does is it doesn't add a lot of weight to their marital issues, As I've kind of said this whole time, I really liked this concept of a slice of life, but the problem with it is that you don't get to connect with characters and their stories and their effects on her as well as you do in a normally structured film. There's a lot of times you're just kind of left going, huh, or what, or, trying to, grab some meaning out of something. And it's not to say that's bad, it's just to say it's not as effective maybe as a different narrative structure would have been. So I also felt like, I don't know how I feel about the kid, the cancer kid in this, and how I feel about his acting. Because my initial thought is that he's not very good. But, again, when you look at it through the lens of the concept, it feels like like the way he was performing was intentional, and it was a specific character choice that either worked or didn't, and I can't tell. I think it worked in some. I think he walks that line really well between a normal kid who's lost or infatuated with someone, an older woman, doing the kind of things a normal kid would do that in another movie would be, or not even in another movie, that in real life you look at and you're like, okay, that's kind of creepy, kid, and not okay, and common sense should tell you that. But what teenager kind of listens to common sense, especially when their emotions and everything are so fucked up, So he walks that line of doing creepy things without the intention of being creepy. He's not trying to hurt her or stalk her or anything like that. He's looking for, answers and doesn't know how else to get them. So he walks that line really well in that. So yeah, but I don't know as a whole how I feel about his performance. So the hard part about this one is grading it. When you look at that final grade, what are you judging it on? And I'm gonna go a B+ for this one. And a lot of that grade is due to a lot of respect to the director and the screenwriter and everybody else for having a very, very solid idea of how they wanted to tell this story and telling it that way. But it has the added consequence of the story feels a bit unfocused. It feels a bit disjointed. And honestly, it feels a touch anticlimactic when the credits happen. There is no resolution to really anything, which again goes with what they're going for. But as a moviegoer, you kind of want some kind of resolution. But so yeah, I go B+ on this one. And I also got to give it. I was almost tempted to give it an A, just from the fact I haven't had to think about a movie this much or dissect a movie this much since Spinning Man earlier in the year. So I'm very grateful to that, because normally, you go see one of these, you can just come out and go, oh my God, that was so great, it was so brilliant, everything was great. Or you can go, oh my God, that fucking sucked, and this is why, and this is why, and this is why. And it's interesting to kind of have that experience again of dissecting the movie and seeing the points and seeing the ideas and how they fit together. So yeah, an interesting way to tell the story. I found it fascinating, if an enjoyable and a good think piece, if nothing else. So that's kind of my judgment on this one. Okay, so don't really have much else to say about this one. Other than, if you're in the mood for something that you want to think about, you're one of those people kind of like me that every now and then you want to talk about your movies a little bit more, then this is a good film to do it on. So go check it out. All right, so we're about midway through fall break, because of course that week you have off is the fastest week of your life. But got one more hopefully planned with my friend Elizabeth a little bit later in the week, so we'll see how that pans out. So as always, thanks for watching. For Chewy, Mr. Chirpy, and Zoe and myself, as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.